the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Most Merciful, I'd like to welcome you, dear viewers, to another in our series, Contemporary Issues. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May Allah's peace and blessings be on each and every one of you. In our series, as you know, we look at various contemporary issues that are relevant to Muslims, non-Muslims in these times, where Muslims have certain practices which are being questioned. Are they relevant? Are they suitable to our time? Or how does Islam tackle the issue? Why does it tackle it in this way? So the issue that we're going to be looking at in this segment is that of separate education. The idea of separating the boys and the girls when teaching them. The model, of mixed education is taken to be basically the standard. It's looked at as being the best educational model, which is coming from the West. But the question remains, we could ask, what studies have been done to prove that in fact this is the best form? How did mixed education begin? In fact, if you go back to the 19th century, you'll find in America, for example, all the way up till about the 50s, about the middle of the 19th century, girls and boys were educated separately. There was separate education there. And this existed in much of the rest of the world. There was separate education. Why? Why did they have separate education and then change? I mean, when you look at the factors which led to it, it had to do with political factors that after the Civil War, where education became, education became the right of everybody. And so you had a huge influx into the schools. Girls were encouraged to also get educated. And they just didn't have enough teachers. At first, what they used to do was they would have a teacher, and that single teacher would teach a class of both girls and boys, but the girls would be on one side of the classroom, the boys would be on the other side. That's what they did at first. And then eventually, the girls and the boys being in the class, eventually the system just allowed itself to flow together. Now, I remember there's another pattern similar to this. When I went to university in Vancouver, in Simon Fraser University, I was majoring at that time in biochemistry. I lived on campus in the dorms. We had dorms for the men and dorms for the women, some distance away. Dorms for the men, dorms for the women were separate. I mean, though in classes, when we went to classes, university classes, we did sit, girls, males, females, mixed. And if we went to restaurants on campus, it was mixed. But the dorms where we were living, the room, each person has a little room, and there's a shared bathroom in each segment. All the boys were together, the girls were together. And in relative close proximity, this also did lead to, issues that normally expect in these kind of circumstances, where some guys would try to sneak into the girls' dorms at night, and all these kind of things would happen. But when I went back to visit the campus, I left the campus back in about 1970. When I went back to visit the campus, maybe about a year or two later, what I found is that they had integrated the campus with the dorms. So girls were now staying in the same dorms with boys, and this became a norm across North America. You had integrated dorms. Girls and boys would be in rooms beside each other. Bathrooms became shared bathrooms, and of course, the corruption that came out of it was far greater. That is part of that norm. Well, it's all the same. We're all equal. No difference between men and women. So why not? But as I said, this process was not a process wherein people went into studies. They did deep studies to the effects of people's, living together, as in the case of the dorm, or studying together in the classrooms, and they've shown that, statistically those who study together do better than those who study separately, and, no. Usually the arguments people will say, well, when they come out into society, they have to mix with each other. So they may as well learn it from education, from the time they're being educated, that this is the reality of society. So Why shouldn't it be reflected in the educational system? However, what they've shown is that experimentally, and there are some recent experiments by teachers in George Dixon's school in Birmingham, UK, they show that girls learn better when educated separately from boys. Consequently, a number of Western educators have recently called for a revival of single-sex schools. Julian Souter, Senior Director, Deputy Head at George Dixon School, is convinced of the advantages of segregation, listing the benefits observed so far as better concentration in class, better behavior, higher achievement, improved teacher attention, all of these. Since the 60s, co-education has been seen as progressive and enlightened, the enlightened choice. This is a development in the society, part of that, you know, women being equal to men. However, in the 70s and 80s, feminist educators began to draw attention to the question of girls' underachievement in areas such as physics and maths. It was noted that their exam results were much better in single-sex schools. A joint report in 1996, the school's inspectors, Ofsted, and the Equal Opportunities Commission, the gender divide, states girls' schools are generally found to perform best. This is general conclusion. Now, there is an issue of boys, right? There is an issue of boys because one may say, well, okay, what about the boys? When they did the studies, they did find that in the case of boys, segregated boys, they were not doing any considerably better. So then why in the case of the girls and in the case of the boys? What they found is that actually in the schools where, and these are primary, secondary level schools, the teachers tended to be women. Women dominate the teaching profession. So when you had a group of all boys, women had much more difficult time controlling the classes. The boys are much more, you know, boisterous and running around, and they had difficulty bringing them under control. And so their performance in class was not improved. In fact, maybe to some degree it became worse because they didn't have that ability. But in those schools, for example, in Dixon School, where they had males teach the boys, they found that the boys did improve. Where there are males, a male figure who is able to establish authority in the classroom, etc., then the learning curve does improve. So it has been shown, really, that there is a difference in a distinct advantage in separate education. And furthermore, we can see really that this, from an Islamic perspective, is a general extension of the separation of the sexes in the society as a whole. Prophet Muhammad, may God's peace be upon him, was reported to have said, teach your children formal prayer at the age of 7 and spring them for it at the age of 10, and separate them in their beds. Males and female separated. The reality is that the separation of children is very, very important, you know, because children experiment, and this can lead to corruption later on in their lives. Homosexuality can be born there. Children have these different experiences. When they come out in society, they experience again other contacts with, you know, homosexuals or whatever, and this may lead them into homosexuality. And we can find that, you know, the sexual abuse, which may also develop out of these circumstances, you know, are reduced. Because what you find is that recently in England, an 11-year-old girl was put on the list of sex offenders for abusing some 6- and 7-year-old boys. And in Florida, an 11-year-old boy was accused of molesting his younger sister in a very much publicized case. I mean, these cases are on the rise, many of them. And part of it is a product of this looseness in terms of how males and females function even at this early age. So I think that, you know, one needs to raise this issue, reflect on it, to understand this distinction, and to recognize that at least in the field of education, it is to the advantage of males and females to receive separate education. But in general, in the society as a whole, that separation is part of the protective system that is there to protect women from possible harm that comes from being in close contact with males. And the number of books which have been written on the abuse and the harm that has come to women on the job, in the West, where people are supposed to be equal, but yet when they're put together in job circumstances, whether they're in a legal profession, whether they're in the military, whether they're in the medical field or whatever, where they're put together, in the newspaper, whatever, you find that women tend to be harassed. Books have been written on the harassment of women on the job. In spite of all the legislation, everything that is there, that they constantly get harassed. So I think that one needs to raise this issue, reflect on it, to understand this distinction, and to recognize that, at least in the field of education, it is to the advantage of males and females to receive separate education. But in general, in the society as a whole, that separation is part of the protective system that is there to protect women from possible harm that comes from being in close contact with males. And the number of books which have been written on the abuse and the harm that has come to women on the job, in the West, where people are supposed to be equal, but yet when they're put together in job circumstances, whether they're in a legal profession, whether they're in the military, whether they're in the medical field or whatever, where they're put together, in the newspaper, whatever, you find that women tend to be harassed. Books have been written on the harassment of women on the job. In spite of all the legislation, everything that is there, that they constantly get harassed. And we can find that even, for example, in Thailand, where I think it's in Bangkok, they decided to have separate buses for men and separate buses for women. Because of the fact that women, when they're being crowded onto these buses, are suffering. In Japan, where they have these, bullet trains, and they have people who just pack people in like sardines into the trains, they had to hire special police that are in the crowd just to catch the gropers, because women being pressed against men and these type of things, men taking advantage of these circumstances. So they had to hire special police to come in there trying to catch these people. And anybody who lives in a circumstance, in the West, in New York City, London, whatever, in Russia, people are jammed together. There's a female, they can tell the horror stories that they have experienced there. This is real. Men tend to take advantage of females there in these positions. I mean, when we look at these circumstances that people are coming together, for the most part, it's males taking advantage of the females. We don't hear so much about females taking advantage of the males. This is the reality. So that separation is also a means of protecting females from harm. And when we look at fields of education, also Islam tries to make a kind of separation, focusing males in areas more male-oriented and females into female professions. For example, in the areas of gynecology. From the Islamic perspective, males would not be encouraged to go in this. Pediatrics is one thing, with children, okay, no problem. But gynecology, this has to do with females. Females exposing themselves to be put into, for a male to take this kind of a job in a Muslim society where women are required to cover themselves, etc. This is seeking corruption. This is a mode for corruption. And how many cases we have, males, whether they're psychiatrists or whether they're whatever, look after so-called female patients, taking advantage of them. So many cases of rape, women under anesthesia being raped, people who are working with psychiatrists who take advantage of them because their personalities are weak or whatever, and they take advantage of them and abuse them. There's so many cases of it. So the idea, even in certain professions, of maintaining a certain separation for the protection of the interests of females is a very valid and useful point which should be considered. So, in Islamic society, where there's a separation, even in the home, for example, where you have a husband, you have a wife, you have children, people come over to visit. The norm is that these people coming, if they're not immediate family, like father, mother, or further children, they are brothers, and in-laws or friends, then the males will congregate together and the females congregate separately together. And this is a general principle, which is for the protection of the society, protection of the family structure. Because when people, come together in this form, this is what, in this loose form where people meet each other and, come with my wife to visit you and, and greeting at the door, I'm kissing your wife, you're kissing my wife, and, this type of thing. This is the first steps to corruption and breakdown of society. Society's basic unit, the family. Very, very important to maintain a certain amount of distance here. From the Islamic perspective, very, very important. And when we consider, so many cases, because especially like in-laws, the brother-in-laws, the Prophet ﷺ said, the brother-in-law is death to the women. That a woman should maintain covering and separation from her husband's brother. Very important, because there's a tendency for that woman to think, oh, it's just my husband's brother, there's nothing, so she becomes loose and so on, so in front of him, and he's a man. He's a man who can be attracted, and it can lead to what kind of, corruption. You have cases happening all over the world so often. I mean, there was a recent case here where an individual, had come to the doctor checking some impotency problems he had, and the doctor said, well, listen, your sperm count is so low, you can't have children. But the man said to the doctor, this was in the newspaper, the man said to the doctor, but I have 3 children. He said, these are not your children. The man was shocked. He went back home, set up cameras in his home, trying to find out who's coming into his home and impregnating his wife. After weeks, nobody. Nothing showing up on the camera. One day he came home early from work, and he found there was somebody in the bedroom with his wife. He started banging on the door, open the door. They wouldn't open the door. He eventually broke down the door. He came in. There was his brother. Those children, which he thought was his own, was the children of his brother. His brother was living with them in the house. He couldn't imagine. The man almost had a heart attack. They had to take him to the hospital, things like that. There's so many cases of this kind, taking place in societies where people don't maintain these proper limitations. And it's happening amongst Muslims, because this is a case of a Muslim. I know in cases, I heard about it in Pakistan and other places, where women tend to be very loose in front of their in-laws, where society tells them, okay, you don't need to cover, this is your brother-in-law, he's like your brother. But then it leads to various forms of corruption. So Islam tries to maintain a division in the society in order to protect the family and the family structure, in order to protect the development, emotional, educational, psychological development of males and females. So the Islamic view is not of separate education, meaning inferior education. There's places like Saudi Arabia where they offering the same thing like that, in the Emirates, where they're offering education for females, which right up to the PhD, they can go ahead and get their education. These things are available to them. It's not separate but unequal. It's separate but equal. Equal opportunity in that sense. This is necessary. And those situations which are attributed, for example, to the Taliban, where they're supposedly denying education to females, I mean, if you listen to what they're saying no, not that we deny education to females, but we need to have separate education. We don't have the infrastructure to set it up right now, so priority is educating the males because they are responsible for the females. So we have to put a priority here. Cases where women are orphans and these type of things, they have made exceptions for them to be able to learn certain skills to help look after themselves. But as a general principle, until they're able to develop sufficient infrastructure, education of the male becomes priority. But they're not opposed because, of course, Islam insists that both males and females should be properly educated. However, separation of the sexes in the society, from the home to the community, to the educational institutions, to the medical institutions, the clinics, and etc. All of these things are for the protection of the family structure, rights of females, protecting them from abuse, where they may suffer, where these kind of limitations and borders are not set up to protect them. So, dear viewers, I hope this point is clear, that when Islam calls to separate education, it is not trying to put women on an inferior status, but just trying to modify and develop behavioral patterns which will be consistent with a modest and chaste society, where premarital sex is the norm, but the exception, where women have a right to full education and to work in fields which are beneficent for the society and which are suitable for them as women, and not jobs that will turn them into men or put them in a situation where they have to deal with a lot of men and suffer under the harassment and abuse from males. With that, dear viewers, I'd like to thank you for being with us in this segment of our program, Contemporary Issues, in which we have looked at the issue of separation of males and females in Muslim society. The goals behind it, what are the concepts? Of course, from a Western perspective, this might seem odd, where people are used to constantly being in contact with other members of the opposite sex. But from the Islamic perspective, where the society is looked at and the harm which comes from such looseness or mixing, etc., is weighed as being far greater than the benefits, and in fact showing that the benefits of separate education and separation in terms of protection of the interests of women far outweigh any harms which we could perceive coming from separate education. With that, I hope you continue to follow our program in the coming segments as we look at various aspects of contemporary issues facing the Muslim world, issues which have come under question, which for centuries, for generations, Muslims have accepted as norm, but which in other times, may appear strange or odd. With that, dear viewers, I'd like to thank you and bid you farewell. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.